They said loyalty mattered, they said hard work would open doors, but for Darnell Jackson, a proud black veteran who gave 20 years of his life to the military, those words meant nothing when spoken by people who only saw his scars as weakness. After 3 years of loyal service at a manufacturing company, Darnell thought he'd finally found peace, a steady job, an honest living, a chance to build something after the war had taken so much. But peace has a way of slipping through a soldier's hands, especially when the battlefield changes from desert sands to corporate floors. Every morning, Darnell arrived before sunrise, uniform neat, boots polished, posture perfect. He didn't need medals to remind him who he was. The discipline was in his bones. His co-workers respected him, most of them, anyway. But one man saw something else. His supervisor, Greg Mason, a man drunk on authority and blind to decency, saw Darnell's quiet strength not as pride, but as a challenge. Greg was the kind of man who couldn't stand someone he couldn't intimidate. And Darnell? He couldn't be broken. It started small. Comments whispered loud enough to be heard. Old man Jackson slowing down again. Maybe those war stories finally caught up to him. The laughter stung, but Darnell ignored it. He'd fought bigger battles than words. He kept his head down, did his job, until the day his body reminded him that some wounds don't heal just because you want them to. His leg, shattered years ago by an IED, flared up so bad he could barely stand. His doctor told him to rest a few days, just to recover. Darnell brought in the medical note, respectful, calm as always. But Greg leaned back in his chair, smirking like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Let me guess," Greg said, voice dripping with mock concern. "The war injury again?" Darnell nodded, trying to keep his composure. "Just need a few days off, sir. I'll be back by Monday." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, maybe this job's too much for you, old man. Maybe it's time we brought in somebody younger, somebody who won't use their service as an excuse." The words hit harder than shrapnel. Darnell stared at him, disbelief giving way to quiet anger. "With respect, sir, I don't make excuses. I do my job. And I've done it well." Greg smirked wider, sliding a paper across the desk. "Then you'll understand this order, soldier. You're done here." For a moment, silence filled the room. Darnell looked down at the termination letter. The reason? Unable to meet physical demands due to service-related injuries. His hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. He'd fought for this country, bled for it, buried brothers under flags of freedom, and now he was being dismissed like a broken tool. But he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He folded the paper neatly, placed it in his folder, then stood tall and straightened his back. And in that small, silent moment, he did something no one expected. He saluted his boss. A perfect, crisp military salute. Greg frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" Darnell didn't answer. He turned, walked out of that office with his dignity intact, the sound of his boots echoing down the hallway like the march of a man who'd already seen worse. His co-workers watched in silence, heads bowed. They knew what they'd just seen wasn't weakness, it was restraint. Outside, Darnell sat in his truck, staring at the folded letter on the passenger seat. His reflection in the window looked older than he felt, but his eyes, those soldiers' eyes, still burned with fire. "You picked the wrong man to underestimate," he muttered, starting the engine. Instead of driving home, he headed straight to a law office downtown. The name on the door read, Angela Torres, attorney at law, Veterans Employment Rights. She was a fellow veteran, someone who knew what it meant to serve and what it felt like to be dismissed by the same nation you defended. She looked up from her desk as Darnell walked in, her expression shifting from polite professionalism to sharp awareness the moment she saw the letter. "They fired you for your service-related injury?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Darnell replied evenly. "They said I couldn't keep up." Angela's eyes narrowed. "Then they just broke federal law." The Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, USERRA. They can't fire you because of a service-related condition. They can't even deny you reasonable accommodation. You gave them every chance to do right, and they threw it away. For the first time that day, Darnell felt something flicker inside him, hope. So, what happens now? Angela leaned forward, her tone firm, almost fierce. Now, we show them that the law protects those who served it. And we make sure your story reminds every veteran that silence doesn't mean surrender. The days that followed were tense and deliberate. Darnell worked quietly behind the scenes, gathering evidence like a soldier preparing for war. He kept records of every time Greg had refused his requests, every cruel remark whispered behind his back, every email that went unanswered. Co-workers began reaching out in secret, offering statements, screenshots, and messages. The factory, once ruled by Greg's arrogance, was turning into a network of quiet resistance. Meanwhile, Greg strutted across the floor like a man untouchable. "Best decision I ever made," he bragged. "The old cripple was dragging us down. Productivity's up already." His words drew nervous laughter, but the workers' eyes told a different story. Then one afternoon, 2 weeks after the firing, Greg sat in his office, feet on the desk, bragging to a supplier on the phone. "Yeah, we cleaned house. Got rid of the liability. What's he gonna do, sue me? Please. I've got money, I've got lawyers, I've got connections." A knock interrupted his boasting. His secretary entered, face pale, holding an envelope. "This came for you, sir. Certified mail." Greg ripped it open, glancing at the seal before his grin faded. The letterhead read, United States Department of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Service. His voice faltered as he read the words, Federal Investigation Notice. "What the?" he muttered, rereading the page. He filed a federal complaint. His confidence wavered. His hand trembled slightly. This doesn't mean anything. I've got lawyers. I'll handle it." But even as he said it, his stomach turned. Because deep down, he knew what he'd done, and that paper in his hand meant the world now knew it too. Across town, Darnell sat with Angela as she reviewed the case file. "They're panicking," she said, smiling faintly. "The evidence is airtight. They can settle, or they can face a federal board. Either way, they lose." Darnell nodded slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "You know, I used to think justice was something you fought for overseas. Turns out, the hardest battles are right here at home." Angela met his gaze. "That's why you keep fighting." That night, Darnell returned to the factory parking lot, sitting in his truck, staring at the building that had once represented stability. Workers leaving their shifts glanced at him through the dim light, some nodding in quiet solidarity. The wind rustled the flagpole out front, the same flag he'd once saluted on foreign soil. He thought about everything he'd endured, every sacrifice made, and how quickly one man tried to erase it all. But justice, he knew, wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring dignity. And as he looked up at that flag waving in the night sky, he smiled faintly. "You wanted a war, Greg," he whispered. "Now you've got one." Because what Greg didn't know, what he never even imagined, was that the veteran he mocked, the old man he discarded, was about to become the reason his empire crumbled. The system Greg thought he controlled was turning against him. The arrogance that once fed him was now setting the stage for his downfall. And as the summons papers reached the company board, and whispers of federal violation spread through the factory, Greg Mason's world began to crack, piece by piece, lie by lie. But this was only the beginning. The world has a way of humbling the arrogant, of turning tables in the most unexpected ways. And for Greg Mason, the man who mocked, humiliated, and discarded a black veteran who had given everything for his country, that day had finally come. Weeks had passed since the summons landed on his desk. What began as quiet denial had turned into sleepless nights and phone calls with expensive lawyers who couldn't find a way to spin the truth. Every line in that termination letter he'd signed was a confession written in ink. Every cruel word he'd spoken was an echo that refused to fade. The arrogance that once filled him was now replaced by a steady, gnawing fear. Meanwhile, Darnell Jackson was calm. Not smug, not vengeful, just steady. Like a man who had already fought his hardest war and knew how to march through chaos with his head high. The lawyer, Angela Torres, had built the case piece by piece, stacking truth on top of truth until it became an unbreakable wall. There were witness statements, recordings, the doctor's notes, the HR emails that were ignored, and the crowning jewel, the letter that fired him because of his service-related injury. It was the very rope Greg had used to hang himself. The day of the hearing arrived. The federal building was cold, sterile, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the rustle of papers being shuffled by men and women in suits. Greg arrived first, dressed in an expensive navy suit that couldn't hide the sweat forming at his collar. His lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Stevens, patted him on the back. "Relax, Greg. It's just a formality. We'll settle it quietly. No one's going to ruin your career over a misunderstanding." Greg nodded, forcing a laugh, but it came out hollow. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was exposure. Then the door opened, and in walked Darnell Jackson. No expensive suit, no entourage, just a well-fitted jacket, polished shoes, and a posture that commanded the room without a single word. The medals pinned to his lapel caught the light. Every eye turned. Even the clerk paused mid-step. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time, he wasn't the one being looked up to, he was the one being looked at. The hearing began. The federal mediator read the accusations aloud: wrongful termination, discrimination based on disability connected to military service, and violation of USERRA. Each charge struck like a drumbeat, and with every one, Greg's face tightened. Angela Torres stood, her voice steady and cutting. "My client, Mr. Darnell Jackson, served this country for 2 decades. He returned home to work honorably, provide for his family, and live with dignity. Instead, he was humiliated, called names, and terminated for the very injuries he sustained in service to this nation. The company violated not only federal law but basic human decency." Greg's lawyer stood to counter. "With all due respect, this is being exaggerated. The company had performance concerns. There was no malicious intent." Angela cut him off, sliding a copy of the termination letter across the table. "Perhaps you can explain why your client signed a document explicitly stating he was being terminated due to service-related injuries. That's not performance. That's illegal." The room fell silent. The federal officer leaned forward, reading the letter slowly, lips tightening. Greg's lawyer's words faltered. Greg stared down, his face pale. Angela continued, voice firm but calm. "And if that wasn't enough, we have recordings, statements made by Mr. Mason himself, mocking my client's injuries, calling him a cripple, and bragging about removing a liability. These were taken by multiple employees, all willing to testify." Gasps rippled through the room. Greg's lawyer turned sharply toward him. "You said there were no recordings." Greg stammered, voice cracking. I didn't think." The mediator raised a hand. "That will be quite enough. Mr. Mason, do you understand the severity of these accusations?" Greg looked up, voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean," he just couldn't keep up. Angela's voice cut through his excuses like a blade. "You mean he couldn't keep up after sacrificing his body for your freedom? After serving a country that allowed you to sit comfortably in that chair while he bled in the desert? That's what you mean, isn't it, Mr. Mason?" The silence that followed was suffocating. The mediator finally spoke, voice grave. "The Department of Labor finds sufficient evidence of a USERRA violation. The case will proceed to formal enforcement unless a full settlement and reinstatement are agreed upon immediately. Greg's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. Greg nodded slowly, broken. The smugness, the arrogance, all gone. He looked across the table at Darnell, eyes hollow, voice small. "I'm sorry." Darnell didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words. When it was over, the outcome was clear. Greg's company would issue a public apology, pay full back wages with penalties, and reinstate Darnell with a federal order ensuring no retaliation. And Greg Mason? He'd be removed from his supervisory position, indefinitely suspended pending further review. The same hands that once signed Darnell's termination letter now signed his own downfall. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Darnell said nothing, only turning to Angela with a faint smile. "Justice," he said quietly, "doesn't always come fast, but it comes." Angela nodded. "And when it does, it stands tall." Days later, Darnell walked back into the factory for the first time since that humiliating day. The air felt different now. The same workers who once watched in silence now clapped as he passed. Some had tears in their eyes. Even the hum of machines seemed to carry a rhythm of respect. Greg wasn't there. His office was empty, desk cleared out. The company had replaced him with a new supervisor, a veteran herself. She greeted Darnell with a firm handshake. "Welcome back, Sergeant Jackson. We're honored to have you." For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. Valued. Whole. But as he settled back into his workstation, a quiet unease lingered. He noticed a few executives watching him from the upper office window, their whispers indistinct. Angela had warned him that victories like this often left enemies simmering beneath the surface. He brushed it off at first, focusing on his work, but when he returned to his locker at the end of the day, there was an envelope waiting for him. No name. No stamp. Just a note written in bold black ink. "You may have won this round, soldier, but some battles aren't fought in court." Darnell stared at it for a long moment, his heartbeat steady. The air in the locker room seemed to thicken. He folded the note carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and exhaled slowly. He'd thought the war was over. He was wrong. Because justice may have been served, but peace, as he was about to learn, doesn't come easy.